Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Rough Rider, where every week we talk writing, self-publishing, and making it as an author. And we're continuing our interview series today, name pending for that series. I still haven't thought of something clever to call it. But today we're joined by author Nicholas Grady. So, hi, Nick. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm really glad to have you on because I've had a lot of fantasy authors on here, and I haven't had
Okay.
someone yet who writes like crime thrillers and mysteries. So
Sure.
I think that's going to be really fun. And
Excellent.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about that genre just because it's and just the process of writing in it because I actually don't have a lot of experience with reading too much of that. Like I know a lot
Okay.
of people who love it. And I it's something I've always wanted to get into. So
Okay.
I think this will be cool. So, I guess to start out, if you want to just let everyone who's watching or listening, kind of know who you are, where you got your start, and then we'll
Sure.
go from there.
Sure. Yeah. My name's Nicholas Grady. I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's where I was born and raised. I've lived other places over the years, but I've always come back here. And I currently live in a suburb of Minneapolis, Robbinsdale, Minnesota, which is fairly close to downtown. And I am primarily a special education teacher. I teach special education at Fridley High School, which is also a suburb of Minneapolis, and have been working there since 2009. Absolutely love the job and I'm very happy with, but I'm also a very passionate writer. I've been writing honestly on and off since I was in the fourth grade. So I finally published my first book in 2023. Under the Bluffs, which is a dark mystery suspense novel about unsolved kidnapping cases involving abandoned caves. And I recently published the sequel, Under the Water, which came out in April of 2024.
Cool. So, a couple of things that I want to start with. So, I've talked with other authors about kind of where they got an interest in the genre that they tend to write in.
Sure.
So, a lot of fantasy authors just kind of I've heard people say like, oh, I have like kind of like a magical worldview. Like I have like I look at the world a certain way, and that's why fantasy appeals to me. Or like sci-fi authors like myself, we have our reasons. So
Sure.
your books that you've published, Under the Bluffs and Under the Water, which are going to be part of a trilogy, I think,
Correct. There will be a
Under
third
the
book
Bluffs
coming out in
trilogy.
2025.
Nice. Okay. So those are crime mystery.
Yeah.
So what about that genre kind of like pulled you into it? Like what about that is the most appealing thing to you that makes you think like, okay, this is a story that I want to write.
So it's kind of an interesting thing. This is actually I've written a lot of stuff over the years, and I've delved in everything from horror to yes, the cat will come get in the frame. I apologize for that.
My dogs will start barking at
Yeah.
some point, so don't
So
worry.
I've delved into everything from horror, sci-fi, just straightforward, dramatic, realistic fiction. I've written some mystery stuff over the years, but had never really published any of this stuff. This was just kind of stuff that I wrote. I even wrote a children's book at one point that I never bothered to publish. But so I've written a lot of different things. But the reason that this one resonated with me was I actually spent a lot of time over the last few years, not planning as being research for a book, but I got really into exploring abandoned caves in my area. So St. Paul, Minnesota, and Minneapolis are along the Mississippi River, and there's a lot of sandstone bluffs in these areas, and a lot of these man-made caves were dug out in the 1850s and a little bit later than that. And a lot of them still exist. And they're these very hidden, dark, creepy spaces. And as I was exploring these spaces, I suddenly got inspired to write something new. And I got this idea initially about this, I don't know, some sort of serial killer who's killing urban explorers as they're going into these caves. And so that kind of got me on the mystery suspense novel path. And then I eventually came up with this idea about this kidnapper for the first book. And that's kind of where the inspiration came from. I love mystery suspense novels, as long as they're darker ones. I'm not a cozy mystery guy. I don't really get into those types of books, you know. But I'm trying to think of what the Peacock series was. My wife and I watched 2 episodes, and I was like, "Oh, this is like Murder She Wrote." I can't remember what it
You're
was
like, I
called.
can't do
The
it.
redheaded gal, I can't remember, who could like read people's minds or something like that, or like tell if people were lying. And I was like, "This is
Mhm.
garbage." But so I write stuff that's a lot darker than that. So it kind of borderlines horror, but it doesn't get particularly gory. It just gets really creepy in
Mhm.
parts. And so I like writing stuff that is realistic. That seems to be more my niche than anything. I'm actually quite jealous of sci-fi and fantasy authors, because when I read their stuff, I'm like, man, how did you come up with all of this? I can't come up with that. So I'm very grounded in reality when I write something. It's very much kind of like this true crime vibe when I'm writing stuff like what I'm currently writing, anyways. And I create what I think are good stories and good mysteries, and I try and throw in plot twists and stuff like that. But I've always, been a fan of mystery to some extent, but oftentimes more in film than in books. I don't necessarily read a lot of mystery unless you count Stephen King or things like that as part of that. So I read a lot more horror and stuff like that when I was younger. But when I started writing again, I found that this mystery suspense vibe was really working for me. So much so that I published the first book, and I already had an idea for the second one and started going with it. And now I've got the third book, which is pretty close to done. I'm just going to wait until next year to publish it, just because I'm, building an audience with a trilogy. So I want it, 1 year for the first book, 1 year for the second book, 1 year for the third book, so that more people, read the books before the next one comes out.
So in terms of timing, like how long did it take you to actually write each of them? I don't know if there was like a similar amount of time for the two that you've written, or one would like came a lot faster to you than the other. But being able to release them like a few years in a row, it
Yeah.
can be kind of challenging. So
Right.
so you've definitely been productive.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
so yeah,
yeah.
I have been. I would say the first book, at least the initial draft, probably took me about 6 months to write, and then maybe another 5 or 6 months to edit and work on it. And I published it. But that was my first book. Under the Bluffs was my very first book. And so that first version that came out of that book wasn't exactly perfect. I wasn't, I'm an indie author. I don't know what I'm doing. So I had to learn a few things. The cover was okay. The formatting wasn't great. There were some grammar mistakes. And within about 2 months of that book coming out, I redid it like 2 or 3 times and re-uploaded the manuscript, because I was like, oh no, this isn't quite right. And then last October, I connected with somebody on TikTok who said, hey, this is really good, but I think I can format this better. And I think that I can get a better cover for you. And if you're willing to let me do that, I will do that for you. And this was somebody I already kind of knew through TikTok. And I said, okay, well, yeah, let's do it. What have I got to lose? So he redid it. And that's the version of this book that's out right now. The cover that you see here, a friend of mine designed, and then he did the formatting, which is much prettier than the original version. And so then I even went back just before the second book came out. I went back and edited the first book one last time, and re-uploaded a manuscript before the second book came out. Now, the second book, that one took me a little over a year to get done, but I knew more what I was doing. I already knew that this friend of mine was going to help me format it and do the cover for me. So I knew when it got to that point that he'd help me with that. I just had to make sure that my grammar was, well checked out, and that I was editing it properly. For me, it doesn't take me that long. My books are not super long. They're about 200 pages, so they're not super lengthy. They're just supposed to be quick, fun reads. So to get through the initial first draft doesn't take me that long. But then with the second book especially, I have a friend of mine who arc reads a lot of my stuff for me, and she was like, you got to fix this, you got to tweak this, so I spent a lot of time editing it, and a lot of time listening. My favorite editing trick that I learned is sitting down and not only reading the book, but letting the MS Word AI read it out loud to me, because you'll hear things that you don't always see. And that, I was like, this is the best thing ever. I'm catching so much stuff that I wouldn't have caught. So I probably went through it like 50, maybe 100 times with that. And then I handed it off to my wife to give a final once over too, just because she's kind of a grammar Nazi and can catch a lot of stuff. So the second book took a little bit longer. The third book I've been working on for about 8 months now, and it'll probably come out in April of next year. So it's going to be a little while before that comes out. But so I'm still kind of in the process with that one. It's done. It just needs a little more work. But so yeah, so I'd say on average about a year for each book.
Okay. And that is a really cool trick when you hear it out loud. Like using the either the Microsoft AI or just like reading it out loud to yourself. It
Yeah,
does.
and
You catch like when you're
yep,
reading, I feel like you have a tendency to like either fill in gaps in your head
yep,
without realizing it or just
yep,
glossing over words because
yep,
you're anticipating what you're about to see. So
yep.
when you read it out loud, you're like, oh, that sounded okay on paper, and then when you hear it out loud, it's like what was that? So
Even when I started reading my stuff out loud, I found that it was even better to have the AI read it to me because I was hearing it like even then, even when I'd read it out loud to myself, I'd miss stuff. But when I let the AI voice, that is, cheesy, but it works. So
yeah, it gets the job done. So that is a good way to catch mistakes that are really
yep,
easy to miss because I've definitely there have been times where I put out I put something out like whether it was a short story or whatever and then found later that I'm like how did I miss this?
yep,
Like I've read this 20 times. Like how
yep,
did I miss this mistake? And it's like, well, that's why because
yep.
eventually you kind of just glide right over these things.
Yeah, I had
So
my first book had been out for, gosh, I'd say about 7 months, and I'd done the new version of it. And a fellow author emailed or responded to a message or something, and he said, "Yeah, I read it. I really liked it." He's like, "There's still a couple grammar things that you might want to go back and tweak." And I was like, "Anything specific?" And he's like, "Well, the one on this page, you accidentally wrote night vision Googles." And I was like, "Oh shit." So I was like, I was like, damn, that's something that your brain would miss. And then, of course, when I went back and let the AI read it, it was like, as he looked through his night vision Googles, I was like, oh God,
Oh
the worst.
no.
That's why I was like, I have to fix this book before the second one comes out. It was good, but it wasn't, perfect. They'll never be perfect. There's always going to be something that you miss that somebody else will catch. But
Yeah. So with the series, what made you decide, because we're all not all indie authors here, but mostly indie authors here who are
sure.
watching these. So every person I actually talk to has a different reason for why they decided to go that route to getting their
Mhm.
books out there.
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot of like common themes going on, but like for you, what was the thing that kind of drove you into self-publishing a book over trying to find a traditional publisher?
Well, here's the thing. I tried to go the traditionally published route at first, and this is an early version of the book, but I was trying to get traditionally published, and I did query a lot of agents, and I probably sent it out to, I don't know, 50 agents, 75 agents. I don't know. I was using Query Tracker, if you're familiar with that, and was like sending out stuff to agents. And I was, for the most part, getting these very generic, almost automated messages in reply. Dear Nicholas, thank you for submitting your work. We thought it was very interesting. We think you should keep trying, but it's not right for us at this time. And it was like, this is a form letter. You didn't even look at anything. You just sent this back. And I get it. I'm a nobody. Like, why would you pay any attention to that? Right. And so I got like, a ton of these back. And I was talking to a friend of mine about it. And he was like, why don't you self-publish it through Amazon? I was like, you can do that? I didn't even know you could at the time. He's like, yeah. He's like, my brother has two children's books out and he's made like, $800 off of them. And I was like, all right, I'll think about it. And then another friend of mine said the same thing, just self-publish it, like see what happens. Like, what's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen is people say your book sucks and you never write again. Or the best thing that could happen is people really start enjoying your book and it does better than you expected, which is the route that mine went, which was great. But So that was kind of the reasoning behind it. Even to the fact that like one of my favorite stories, I made a TikTok video about this a few months back. I got an email from an agent that I had sent a query to well over a year ago. And it was the same kind of form letter saying, thank you for submitting your work. It's not right for us at this time. And I'm like, meanwhile, while waiting for your response, my first book has sold over 400 copies and the second book has sold over 50 copies. I'm like, there you go, right there. That like I could still be spinning my wheels for another 5 years. And I'm an older guy. I'm 49. So I'm like, I'm not gonna wait around forever for this. I'm just gonna do this and see what happens. And it turns out that, I'm not gonna buy a yacht anytime soon, but like the
But you
book,
got your story out there
the story of that, and right,
instead
and
of
that's the
waiting
important
on
thing.
people
Right. And it's
to
not,
basically give you
and
permission
that's
to
the
do
thing.
it. Yeah.
It's not about how much money you make. I mean, if I make a few bucks, great, but it's more about getting that story out there and hearing that people are enjoying it and seeing the reviews and having people respond to it. That's what it's about. So, that's what I wanted to do, and that's what I accomplished. So for me, it's, just was a better route to go.
I totally understand all
Yeah.
of that. I feel like self-publishing is almost like extending beyond just books at this point. Like it's so common in every industry. It's
Yeah.
just not necessarily like very obvious that it's that form. Like people will now get their start in music on YouTube or TikTok.
Right.
You're essentially self-publishing.
Yeah.
Like instead of waiting on a record label
Right.
to pick you up when you have songs to sing,
I
you want people to hear it.
Yeah.
And same thing with writing, and then even with just so the only reason I just thought of this is so I live in Vegas. I work in
Right.
like plastic surgery and aesthetics. So I know
Okay.
a lot of patients who have like OnlyFans and stuff like that. That
Okay.
even that is like basically self-publishing for
Yeah,
people.
absolutely.
So I get what it's like to just you just want to get it out there instead of
Yeah.
feeling like, you need to wait on something.
Right. And I
And
honestly feel like that is like I've said to my friends, I've said, you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 10 to 20 years that traditional publishing goes out the window because it's so hard to get traditionally published as a new author. I watched a TikTok video about this gal who had an agent and was trying to get traditionally published, and they went to like 3 different publishers, and they finally got a third one to accept the book and said, okay, we're gonna take this book as long as you do this, this, and this with it. So she had to go back to the drawing board, spent like 6 months editing it and doing all these things. It went before their board of directors, whatever, at the publishing company, and she got outvoted negatively, like by 1 vote. And it was like she did all that work for nothing. And then it was like they had to go after another publisher. Meanwhile, I'm like, well, my shit's already published, so
mhm,
it might not be
yeah.
a #1 bestseller, but it is
Mhm,
selling. So
yeah.
so it's just um, yeah,
Yeah, no,
completely agree.
I feel you, and I really think that a lot of the people who are watching this are going to feel the exact same way
Yeah, absolutely.
about the entire situation.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, like so with self-publishing, I know, like when I did mine, like when I decided to self-publish my books, I knew nothing about it at the time. Like
that's
when
how
I
I
first
was
got it,
too.
nothing, like literally nothing. Like if you look at like my first novel has like an obscene number of ISBNs because I didn't like know what you need. Like I didn't know the requirements for ISBNs. I didn't know what required a change in an
Yeah,
ISBN. Like it was a mess because I really didn't have anyone to guide me with
yeah,
it. So much of it was trial and error.
yeah.
So like for you, did you have anyone who like along the line was able to kind of guide you along, or a lot of this was you kind of figuring it out for
Well,
yourself?
like, so I mean, initially, like, I mean, I honestly was just going to publish the ebook first, and that probably would have been fine. But then I had friends bugging me to get paperbacks because they wanted to have physical copies and have them signed. And then I created this physical copy, which the original physical copy of which there's about 20 in existence looked terrible. There's no page numbers. There's all kinds of things wrong with it that I didn't know what I was doing, clearly. So I learned. I figured out how to put page numbers on my book and fix a couple other things, but it still wasn't, perfect. And then, like I said, the guy that really helped me out a lot is an author, a fellow indie author who's been doing this for quite a while, a guy named Christian Francis. You might be familiar with him. He lives in the UK and he writes sort of these dark horror novels. And I'm actually I wrote a short story for an anthology that he's putting out in August, I think, where we're raising money for charity. And he was the one that reached out to me after getting my book and said, "Hey, I like what you're doing here, but your formatting's crap and your cover's crap." And he's like, "I'm not trying to be negative here, but I can make this look way better." And I was like, well, let me look at, I was like, I mean, we'd already been friends on TikTok, but I didn't really know him. I'd just seen a couple of his videos. I was like, well, let's see how many books he has out. The guy had like 9 books out. And I was like, okay, well, this guy clearly knows what he's doing better than I do. So I was like, yeah, okay, help me out here. And so then when I published my second book, I reached out to him. And the first time around, he wouldn't, like, he did it free of charge. He wouldn't let me pay him anything the first time. I was like, I can pay you something. He's like, nope, I'm just trying to help you out. I'm just trying to help another indie author. And I was like, are you sure? And he's like, yep, I'm good. So when my second book was getting ready to be published, I contacted him and said, hey, I got another book coming out. Are you willing to format and do the cover for me? And he's like, yeah, absolutely. What are you looking for? And so I sent him, some notes and stuff like that. And so then he came up with this like amazing cover for the second book, and like beautiful formatting. And he added like a photo of me and my little bio info in the back and just all kinds of good stuff. And the second time around, I insisted. I was like, I have to pay you something. I'm like, you can't not. So he finally was like, okay, here's my PayPal. So I didn't pay him a ton. I sent him $100 on PayPal. I was like, that's totally worth it. He's good enough at it that it doesn't take him long to do it. But he was like flabbergasted. He was like, I thought you were going to send me like $30. I'm like, well, like you're I'm probably going to ask you to do this on the third book, so I'll pay you at this point. So he's been super helpful with that, and I've met other indie authors along the way too that have helped me with ideas about making your work better. I mean, there's just so much out there in TikTok and Instagram and other places, ideas for promoting stuff. It was funny because I saw a video that you did the other day where you were talking about putting copies of your books out in like the free little libraries
Oh
around
yeah,
and stuff
yeah.
like that, which
It
is funny.
works. I've done it.
That was one of the first things that I did when I published my book is I got a bunch of authors copies and I stuck them in the free little libraries. But here's my funny story with that. So I put about 10 copies out around the city, and within 3 days of that happening, keep in mind my book had been out for about a week. The paperback had been out for a week. Suddenly there was a used copy available on Amazon. And I
Oh
was like,
wow.
why is there a used copy of my book on Amazon? This just came out. So I looked up the seller, and the guy actually had his address listed. Like it was just some, an individual seller. And the guy lived 2 blocks from one of the little libraries that I had dropped a copy of my book off at. And I was like, oh, you little
Look at that.
sneaky bastard, you. And he was like selling it for like $4. I'm like, what are you gonna get $2 out of that? I'm like, you
Mhm.
must rate this thing every week and try and sell these online. The funny thing is though, is eventually that used copy sold. And I was like, well,
Really?
I read
Okay.
somebody bought it. That means they were willing to pay for it. So they probably read the book. So all in all, not really that
Yeah.
bad of a deal. I wasn't going to get any money for it anyways. So,
Mhm.
but
That's so funny.
it was really funny. I was like, really? You're selling my, like, okay. And I
They're
even
just
had a little,
they're like lurking at these neighborhood book
yeah.
fairs,
And I
like
had
looking
even put
for
a little
books.
note in there that was like, hey, I'm an indie author. This is my first book, blah, 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 and like signed it and stuff. And like this guy was totally selling it on like
Wow.
Amazon. Yeah.
Oh man.
Yep. It was the only time
Well,
that happened, but
well, let's talk about the book a little more.
yeah,
I want to kind of go into that. So,
sure,
um, I do want to ask you something before we actually talk about, the like the real details of the book. So,
sure.
you had mentioned saying like that you were sort of envious of fantasy and sci-fi authors that we got like we make all this stuff up and it's like this big fantastic universe. But I'll tell you, some of us just really write in that genre because we don't want to have to do any research on anything. So that's really all it is for me. So I
Good
just
point.
and then no one can ever contradict it. You can just be like, well, if it doesn't make sense, it's because it's not real. But
Right.
you're writing books that take place in Minnesota.
Yep.
So I don't know if the towns that you depict are real towns or
Yes,
if
they are.
they're fictional. Okay. So like you're depicting real places.
For the most
You
part. I
yeah.
fictionalize a little bit. In the first book, there's mentions of some locations in the first book that aren't real, as well as the second book, but most of them are real places, including the caves that are described are mostly places that I have explored. Some of them are exaggerated a little bit for dramatic
Mhm.
effect, but
Oh
they
yeah, of
are
course.
real spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, and then and because you're writing a crime story, I know that your characters, at least for the second one, because the under the water, the description mentioned there being cops as characters or like
Yeah,
detectives as
it's the same.
characters.
It's yeah,
So
same characters as the first book, and
mhm.
some of them are police officers. Yes.
Yeah, so you're writing about things that are like real world in a
Right.
way.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's probably harder in some ways than making up a bunch of like alien races that no one can ever question you about.
Right.
So that's I think I have a lot of respect for anyone who actually writes in the real world because for some people that's actually not that easy.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit then about, I guess we'll start with Under the Bluffs. Maybe we
Okay.
should focus on that one because that's the first book, and then we want to
Sure.
get people into your trilogy. So
Sure.
let's hook them in with this.
Sure.
So tell me, I know you mentioned serial killers and abandoned caves, both of which are, as someone who likes horror a lot, sounds pretty cool to me. So
Yeah.
go from there. Tell us about the book.
So the idea behind the first book is that basically the whole premise is that the book starts. It starts in 1983. Now I specifically set the book in the 80s into the early 90s, and the follow up books take place in the like 94 to like 1996, so just barely into the mid 90s. And one of the reasons I did that is because DNA evidence was not as concrete as it is now. So I was able to write a crime novel where it was like, oh, one hair, there was some DNA, but not as much back then, and it wasn't as reliable. So the synopsis of the first book is basically the whole thing starts in 1983, and there's this detective Ron Clark. He's sitting in his office or at his desk in the police station one day. It's a early April. There's this snowstorm that's kind of unexpected, and everybody's out dealing with car accidents that are being caused by this or traffic jams, and he's just kind of sitting in the station by himself, right? Because he doesn't really have anything to do that particular day, and he gets this letter written in green ink, which he finds kind of weird. And he opens it up, and all it says is, "Two will disappear. You will not find them." And he's like, "Well, what is this?" And so he kind of, he goes to his lieutenant and he talks to him. He says, "What do I do with this?" They said, "Well, we don't know what this is. This could be a prank. This could be a hoax. We've had this kind of stuff happen before." And he's like, "Okay, well, I'll bag and tag it and we'll go from there." So he leaves for the day. He stops into a local bar because traffic's terrible. And he gets this call. There's more descriptive going on than that, but I won't go into. There's stuff involving the two kids that go missing, but I won't delve into that. So these two kids go missing, and he gets a call that says these two kids went missing, and he's like, "Huh, that's kind of coincidental. I just got this letter in the mail, and now these two kids go missing." So he tries to track down these kids, tries to find them. He has absolutely no luck. They disappear completely. Does not find them at all. They're just gone. And he continues to try and figure out things related to this case for a time period, but eventually the case goes cold. 2 years later, he gets another letter saying two more will disappear. You will not find them. And the same thing happens again. And this goes on for 10 years. So basically, two kids disappear every 2 years over the course of 10 years, and he doesn't find them at all. And then we kind of jump forward to, and he's getting really frustrated by this point. Then we jump forward to 1993, and these two young kids who are just out of high school, Tony and Jeff, who are basically, they don't know where their lives are going. They're smoking a lot of weed. They're working at an auto parts warehouse. They got their high school diplomas, but they're still living at their parents' house. They're riding around on skateboards, and they do a lot of urban exploring. And so they're exploring this cave one day, and they get into this cave that they have never discovered before. And it looks like it hasn't been infiltrated in many, many years. And they go in and they kind of find their way into this thing, and they go way to the back of this cave, and they find this kind of like almost like an underground lake where it's been very, very flooded. and one of the kids notices something, and as he gets closer and pulls it out of the water, he realizes that it's a kid's body, and they flee. They like freak out and they flee the cave. Well, of course, that kid turns out to be one of the first kids that went missing in 1983, and they give it anonymous tips to the cops. And so the cops, or Ron Clark in particular, starts investigating these caves to figure out what the heck is going on. The problem is that the city of St. Paul's knowledge of caves is not that vast, and his own knowledge of caves isn't that vast. So eventually, through certain circumstances, he's able to connect up with these two young guys, Tony and Jeff, and they start working with him, investigating these caves to find more evidence, and then eventually work together with him to try and solve this crime and catch this kidnapper before they strike again. So that's kind of the plot of the first book.
Well, you sold me on it because no, like like I said, it's not
it's
really a
really dark
genre I
and
read a
creepy.
lot, but that actually intrigues me quite a bit.
Yeah,
So,
it's been well reviewed. So
yeah. And it seems like that's a genre that tends to do it. It seems more sellable than others, at least right now. Like true crime is so big,
it
that
is,
like
and it isn't.
I
I feel with, at least with the TikTok audience, if you're selling some sort of weird, dark, spicy romance or a fantasy novel with some spice in it, that seems to be the two biggest things that are hitting right now. Like if I see one
on
more
TikTok
video
for
of
sure,
if
for
I see one
sure.
more video
Yeah.
about Fourth Wing on TikTok or Iron Flame, I swear to God, like I am not going to read the Top Gun with Dragons book ever. Sorry, I have no interest in that. Like I have no interest in that.
Yeah, yeah. On TikTok, that's definitely
Yeah,
more marketable. But like, I know so many people who they just like they love true crime podcasts. They love the documentaries that
yeah.
come out on Netflix.
Mystery. I mean,
Like,
mystery's great, and
yeah,
I mean, even though my books are fictional, they're very much a true crime kind of vibe. Like that's. I mean,
yeah.
I've had people in reviews say that they got like a Criminal Minds episode vibe, or one person said that they thought that the first book was like binging a season of True Detective in like 2 days, in a book. So I mean, that's kind of the vibe that people have gotten from it. So
Cool.
that's what I was going for. So because
Good.
I mean, the stuff that I write is very like I'm not very flowery and poetic with my prose. I'm very straightforward. I tell my story, and I keep the dialogue fairly simple. They're meant to be kind of these quick, fun reads, and that's what most people. I just met with a friend of my wife's book club had read my book, and I met with them last night to discuss it. And they were like, I read it in like 2 days. The second book, they were like, I just flew through it. Like I just opened it and I was like, oh wow, I finished that. So, and that was kind of the idea behind it. So
I almost feel like there's sometimes it's more I see it online among writers, that it seems like people almost like they're almost expecting books at this point to be either super long and like so I'm trying to think of how to word this. Like people want it to be like this extremely like it has to be super literary and super everything has to be like really introverted, and it has to have like lots of exploration into like all sorts of super deep things in order for it to be have any value. As if people act like you can't just have a book that is fun to read.
right,
Like and I'm not saying that your book doesn't have those things, but it's
right,
just, you're writing like for the sake of entertaining someone,
right,
and that's
yeah,
what we want, right? Like you want people
yeah,
to enjoy your story, but it's almost like if you don't there are people who act kind of snooty about things, where if a book does have a kind of popular appeal or something that would appeal to people like that, and just be entertaining, just fun,
yeah,
like a not a read that's not going to take you a full month
right.
to get through.
There was definitely a period in my life when I was probably in my mid 20s where every book I read had to be deep. I was reading
Yeah.
I was reading a lot of Dostoevsky and Charles Bukowski and Henry Miller and things like that that got very cerebral, and it was like, somebody would mention a Tom Clancy novel and I'd be like, no, not,
Hmm.
so I
Yeah,
mean,
that's it. Exactly. Okay.
I went
Yes,
through
that's
my
exactly
snooty
what I
era
mean.
like
Yeah,
that too.
yeah,
Yeah. Like,
yeah,
I get
yeah.
it.
So
Yeah, my
it's just
book is
it
definitely
drives me
more so
crazy.
on the side of commercial fiction as opposed to like, your deeper stuff, and I'm okay with that,
But there's nothing wrong with that, and I just
No.
feel like people need that though. Like
Yeah.
they do well for a reason, because it appeals to something that people need, and people need
I
entertainment.
I had a coworker who uh, is I didn't even know until she read the book, and she asked me after. She's like, "Did you deliberately write this?" She was like, "I know you're a special education teacher." She's like, "Did you write this deliberately for people with ADHD so that they could like follow?" And I was like, "No." And she's like, "Well, I'm ADHD, and this is the first time I finished a book in like 2 years, and I whipped through it and I loved it." I'm like, "Cool."
That's so good.
I was like, "That's great."
That's awesome. Well, I'm interested, and I am actually going to go check that out because I think that this is going to be this might be my way into like this genre
There you
and
go.
kind of
And
getting
you've
me
got a
into it
second
because I've
book that you can
never.
follow up with too. So
Yeah. So let everyone know where they can find that. They can find this on Amazon, right?
yes, it is sold on Amazon right now exclusively. So unless you happen to come to one of my book signing events, if you do want to come to a book signing event, I have one coming up on July 26th at the Wicked Wart Brewing Company in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. So if you happen to be there, I will be selling books on that date.
That's awesome. Before we wrap it up, I want to ask you about
Yeah,
that because I think that's something that people are going to be interested in, and I actually don't know anything about it. When it comes to book signings
yeah.
and stuff like that, how do you go about even setting one up? Like, how does
I
that
mean,
work?
it's much like everything else I've done. You know, I've gotten a few articles written about the book by bugging different local news media outlets, newspapers, and things like that, and being like, "Hey, I'm a local guy. I wrote a book," and when somebody responds, I try and get something about that out of that. I just had a local news channel do an interview with me last week, and but it took me a year. I bugged them for a year, and they finally were like, "Okay, we'll do this now." Like they're like, "We're gonna throw this baby on the
Perseverance.
line."
It
Yeah,
pays off.
perseverance for sure. But so I mean, the one thing for me with the brewery situation is breweries are always looking for something to draw people in. Like a lot of people are like, "Oh, do it at a bookstore, do it at a library, do it at this." I'm like, not necessarily. This is going to be my third signing at this brewery. Now, it doesn't hurt that I know the owner and we're good friends and I've got to know him over the years. So when I tell him I want to sell my books, he's like, "Sure, yeah, we'll figure out a date." But what I usually do is I do a couple of steps. So I will reach out to them about 2 months before I want to do something like this, and I'll get a date set. Then I'll start posting on my Facebook page and stuff like that to let friends know about it. And then I'll print up a couple of posters and ask them to put them up maybe a month in advance in the brewery so people see it, and ask them to put something up on their Facebook events. And then what I usually do when I make those posters is I say, "Okay, Nicholas Grady, book signing, blah, 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 blah." But I always include this little disclaimer that says, there will, if you have a copy of the book, you can bring it and he will sign it at no charge. If you do not have the book yet, there will be copies available at the event, but copies will be limited. So if you want to guarantee a signed copy, buy a copy in advance on Amazon ahead of time. And so what ends up happening usually is I'll sell a decent amount like the month before on Amazon, and then some people will show up at the event and just buy one on site that showed up hoping there would still be one there. Or sometimes you just get some walkthrough looky loos that are like, "Oh, what's this?" And, "Oh, these are my books and this and that. Oh, I'll buy those." So that's kind of how I've done it. Like that's worked pretty well for me so far. So that's kind of the way that I've done it. Like I said, I've done um three events, a couple of really impromptu ones. The only one that completely failed was we had there was like a neighborhood wide garage sale like a month ago, and I kept promoting that I was going to be selling copies of my books at the garage sale, and I didn't sell one single copy of the book at this garage sale. But I mean, I had women who were like 60, and they'd see like my wife sold Beanie Babies that were like two for $1, and they'd be like, "How about three for $1?" I'm like, "Well, you're not going to spend $15 on a book." Like what was I thinking? Why would I think that I was going to sell books at a garage sale? The only thing that did happen was there was one lady, this woman who was about 65 years old, pulled up in the alley just as we were shutting the garage sale down on the second day. And we're like, "You looking for the garage sale?" And she's like, "Well, I was just going to see if I could get Nick to sign my book." And I've never seen this woman in my life. And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'll sign it for
Oh,
you."
sure.
She had a copy of the second book, and I signed it for her. And that was like, all right, I didn't sell any books, but I had a fan show up and get their book signed. So that was pretty cool. Yeah, so that's kind of what I do when I set up those events. Is I try to pre-plan a little bit, and definitely putting that whole Copies will be available at the event, but they'll be limited. So if you want to guarantee a signed copy, buy in advance in Amazon, and then I usually sell them, when I sell the author's copies at events, I sell them for a little bit more than Amazon. And honestly, people still get a good deal because if you buy my book through Amazon, I think the paperbacks are $12.99, and then you pay whatever shipping. So you're probably paying like $16, $17 by the time you get that book, right? When I sell them in person at events, they're signed and I sell them for 15 bucks. I make a lot more profit on that than an Amazon sale, obviously, because I'm only paying the price of the author's copy, which is about $5. So I don't make $10 a copy off my Amazon sales. You probably know this as well as I
Oh, I
do. So
I know well. I'm
yeah,
constantly like, please buy the ebook. I know you hate digital. We'll do that. At least I make like something reasonable off of
yeah.
that. Like I use Ingram Spark for like print on demand,
Okay.
and their printing costs are even higher than Amazon.
Okay.
So you really don't make much off
Yeah,
of
I
a
make
print
I
book.
make a little more on my paperbacks than I do on my digital versions, but that's because my digital versions are priced at a lower price too. So my paperbacks are priced at $12.99. My Kindle versions are priced at $4.99. So my TikTok or social media promo is always you can get both books for under $10. But so I make a little over $3 for the Kindle versions when I sell one of those, whereas the paperbacks I make a little over $4 on those. So
Mhm. Well, cool. And like I think a lot of people would dream of being able to do like a book signing publicly. So
it's
a
pretty
lot of people who
cool.
watch. So that must be really cool to
It's
actually
really
do
fun.
that.
It was really weird the first time because I had a lot of people, like I had some friends show up, and then I started having all these people show up that I'd never met before, and that was really weird. Like it was cool, but
Mhm.
it was like super weird. And
Yeah.
my wife jokes all the time. She's just like, "Yeah, you and your little old ladies," because like the first time I did a book signing, like 60% of the like I wrote this book. This book was meant to be like both of these books were kind of meant to be geared towards like a teen audience. It was supposed to be like a mystery suspense novel geared towards people around the ages of like, 14 to 17. And here I have all these little old ladies with canes walking up to get their book signed. Like 60% of the people that showed up at my book signing event the first time were little old ladies. And I was like at the brewery. And I'm like, what the hell? And my wife's like, there's your audience. I was like, that's not what I expected my audience to be, but I'll take it.
I guess you could never really predict like
Oh,
who it's gonna appeal to ultimately. But
yeah.
no, that's great that you've gotten to do that. And I hope that anyone who's like actually hoping to maybe do a book signing one day takes Nick's advice here on ways that you can go about actually setting that up, because focusing on local things like local newspaper, local news, like that's going to be the way that you can actually get people to potentially pay attention. When you start
Yeah.
trying to like, you're trying to go at the entire world all at once,
Yeah.
it's that's tough. So I mean, not that it's not tough to get local people to pay attention to you. You had to do it for a while before someone did,
This
but they eventually
this
did. And if you just
this
stick with it,
one little article
oh,
right
that's so
here,
cool.
this
Like
one
I
little article right here sold me like 30 copies. So, and I've had four different ones written just by, and these aren't even major newspapers in Minneapolis or St. Paul. They're just like the little local neighborhood newspapers. But those are the people that are more willing to like interview you and do an article with you and stuff like that. I finally got just last week, the literary critic from the St. Paul Pioneer Press, which is the second largest newspaper in Minneapolis, is actually going to read and review my book at some point. I don't know when. She said there's a lot ahead of it, and it could be a negative review. But I'm like, well, press is press, and it's been out
Press
for a
is
year, so
press.
yeah.
Yes.
I'm like, at this point, like it's been out for a year, so a negative review isn't going to kill me at this point any more than I'm, already am. So
That's fantastic. I love
yeah,
that. So, yeah, people, if you're looking to try to get some exposure, like focus on the your local area first. If you're looking to try to get into a newspaper or article or something, you're going to have a lot more of a chance of doing it that way than, going too big. So Nick, thanks so much for
thank
being
you.
here. I had a lot of fun.
Me too.
And I am now feel like I'm going to be taking a look at crime novels from now on,
Perfect.
and the fact that it's on the darker side, as someone who likes horror. I know you said it's not horror, but I think that that's going to appeal to me for
They're
sure,
dark
and
and
a lot
creepy
of the
though, and
people.
they get darker every book. They get a little edgy, closer on the edge towards horror each book. Like
Okay,
they're still
okay.
mysteries, but they get a little bit more intense every time. So
Cool. Well, I'm going to check them out, so everyone else should too. So I'm going to put the links for author Nicholas Grady's. I'm stumbling now. It's been a long day.
okay,
Author Nicholas Grady's books in the description for this video. So you can check out the Under the Bluffs will be a trilogy right now. That you've got first book Under the Bluffs, and
yep.
then second book Under the Water. So go check those out. I'm also going to put links for Nick's social media so you can follow him as well. Supporting other indie authors is what we do here. So please go ahead and do that. And thanks again, Nick, for being here. I had a great time.
Me too.
Thanks again, everyone. And if you would be interested in appearing on Rough Rider, if you're an indie author or have written a story, please feel free to send me an email at roughrider@protonmail.com. And until next time, thanks so much, everyone. God bless you all.